So when you think of the First World War, what comes to mind? For most of us, it's these really powerful images, right? Things we've seen in movies and read in poems. But what if that memory we all share is actually built on a series of huge paradoxes? Today, let's unpack the complicated and often really misunderstood memory of the Great War.
You've probably heard it summed up in one really famous phrase: lions led by donkeys. It paints this picture of incredibly brave soldiers being sent to their deaths by clueless, incompetent generals, all sitting safe and sound miles from any danger. And right alongside that, you get this picture: a pointless slaughter in the mud. A war fought over just a few yards of land, where millions of lives were lost for, seemingly nothing at all. I mean, it's a powerful story, right? All about futility and waste.
But is that really the whole picture? Is that collective memory of ours actually accurate, or has it been kind of simplified over the last 100 years? Well, that's the big question we're going to dig into right here.
You know, a lot of our popular memory, think shows like Blackadder, it gives us this very specific, kind of restricted vision of the war. Now, it can be hilarious and deeply moving, but it creates a very narrow picture of what was really going on. So, while our memory is kind of stuck in this narrow corridor of trenches in Flanders, the reality, whoa, it was a truly global conflict. It was fought high up in the Italian Alps, across the Masurian lakes in Eastern Europe, and all over the continents of Africa and Asia. And it wasn't just soldiers. It involved sailors, laborers, women, and children from pretty much every corner of the globe.
Okay, let's tackle the first big paradox here: this incredibly powerful cultural myth of the lost generation. This is the idea that a whole generation of Britain's best and brightest was just wiped out in the trenches.
Yeah, it's an idea that's really stuck with us. It feels true. But do the numbers actually back that up? Did Britain really lose an entire generation of its people?
Okay, first things first, we absolutely have to acknowledge the devastating human cost. Around 750,000 British soldiers died in the war. That is a staggering, just tragic number. And you can totally see how the idea of a lost generation would take hold.
But here's where it gets really surprising. To put that number in perspective, get this. The influenza epidemic that swept across the globe right after the war, it actually killed more people in Britain than all 4 years of fighting combined.
And this is the paradox, right at the heart of the lost generation myth. The cultural belief is that the war left this permanent hole in the population. But the demographic reality? The numbers show that while the losses were just awful, it was a statistical blip. Britain's population was back to pre-war levels by the mid-1920s.
So if the math doesn't really add up to a demographically lost generation, where did this incredibly powerful idea come from? Well, the answer seems to be that our memory of the war was shaped way more by things like literature and art than it was by economics or population statistics.
Well, that brings us to this fascinating battle of ideas, almost like two different wars being told through the voices of two very different poets. And these two guys really came to define the war's memory for all the generations that followed. On one side, you've got Rupert Brooke. His poetry was all about celebrating patriotic sacrifice. And on the other side, you've got Wilfred Owen, who wrote about the pity of war. Now look at those sales numbers. In the years after the war, Brooke sold over 300,000 copies. Owen, barely 1,400. That tells you everything you need to know about which message was hitting home at the time.
You see, Brooke's poetry offered this vision of noble, clean sacrifice. It gave comfort, it gave meaning to hundreds of thousands of grieving families who desperately needed to believe their son or husband or brother's death wasn't for nothing. And that feeling was the dominant one for a very long time.
And then you have Owen, who just comes in and completely shatters that idea. He flat out calls the ancient saying that it is sweet and fitting to die for one's country the old lie. And, amazingly, it's his view that has now come to completely dominate how we think about the war today.
But here is the really crucial point, the one that changes everything. Owen's view only really took over in the 1960s. That's almost 50 years after the war even started. For decades, people didn't see the war as just this pointless tragedy. It held all these different complex meanings for the people who actually lived through it. The way we see the war today, it's actually a pretty recent invention.
And all of this builds to what might be the biggest paradox of them all. How could a war that we remember as so pointless and unnecessary
also be the single most important, most world-shaping event of the modern age.
So you've got this massive conflict in how we remember the war. The common view is that it was this awful tragedy that just defied all common sense. But the historical reality is that this war was the crucible that forged the 20th century and frankly continues to shape the world we're all living in right now.
In fact, a lot of historians talk about something called the short 20th century. And for them, it doesn't start in 1900. Nope, it starts in 1914 with the war. And it ends in 1990 with the end of the Cold War, a conflict that only existed because of World War I and the Russian Revolution it directly caused.
Just think about the consequences here. They were absolutely world-altering. The war brought about the collapse of four massive empires. It created a whole bunch of new countries in Eastern Europe. It led to the birth of the Soviet Union. It drew the maps that are still at the root of conflicts in the Middle East. And it announced the arrival of the United States as a true global power. So, a feudal war? I don't think so.
Okay, so why does any of this matter today? Why should we wrestle with these paradoxes? Because ultimately it forces us to face this huge challenge of how we judge the past from the comfort of our present.
There's this quote that, for me, just gets right to the heart of it. It says, "It behooves us to think as they did then, not as we do now." And that's the ultimate challenge, right? To try and understand people from the past on their own terms, not just ours.
I mean, we look back now and we just wonder, how could they have possibly endured that? But here's the twist. Our modern skepticism about war, our international institutions, our entire worldview, so much of that was forged in the fire of that very conflict. We are literally judging the war using a mindset that was created by that very war.
And that leaves us with one last big question. How should we remember a war that was, at the same time, a tragic loss of life and the birth of our modern world? A war we remember as feudal, but one that completely reshaped the globe. A war of lions and donkeys, of poets and empires, of memory and of math. The answer's not simple, is it? And maybe, just maybe, the most honest way to remember is to just embrace all of those contradictions.